My name is Chris Huhne. I'm the chair of the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association, which is the Green Gas UK trade association representing the producers of biogas and biomethane in the UK. And we are here on this webinar to talk about a report which we commissioned from BMA, Business Modelling Applications, and we worked together on producing a whole energy system modelling exercise showing the impact of adding biogas, biomethane into the whole energy system. And I'm delighted that today we have two key writers of the report, Dr. Gareth Mottram, who's the policy lead at ADBA, who I think is top on my screen here, and Craig Mauelshagen, who is the lead participant from BMA in the modelling exercise. And just before I kick over to Gareth to discuss some of the key findings, I wanted to pick out a couple of my favourite findings from it, because I think that they really underline the extent to which UK policymakers in particular have underestimated the advantages of biomethane until very recently. And the first thing is the modelling, I think, pretty clearly shows that a dispatchable renewable resource, i.e. a renewable resource which can be turned on and turned off and easily stored, has fantastic advantages over intermittent resources like solar and like wind. Because if you don't have that dispatchable resource to back up the solar and wind, you need to massively overinvest in the amount of offshore wind turbines, the amount of solar, in order to ensure that somewhere you're actually getting yield from the turbines, the offshore wind turbines, or from solar. And therefore, the dispatchable nature of biogas as a backup really makes a difference in terms of cutting costs. You don't have to invest so much in a lot of other things. You also save money on transmission grids. You also save money on storage. So we're going to go into some of that. But the key, I think, takeaway for me is that the dispatchable nature of this renewable, of biogas and biomethane, means that it is able to save substantial amounts of money through the net zero energy system. Second key takeaway, which we're only beginning to really get to grips with, is that the process of purifying biomethane, when you put it into the gas grid, you strip out the CO2. And because the CO2 is 40 to 50% of the total biogenic created biogas, it's very dense, and it's therefore really rather cheap to collect it, capture it, and subsequently store it. So one of the things which is very clear now from the evidence is that biogenically created CO2 captured in the process of biogas being turned into biomethane is far cheaper than any other way of capturing CO2. So, for example, the government is spending billions, more than 10 billion, some reports it was 20 billion, on carbon capture and storage, which is mainly after the event, once you've burnt fossil gas. And then, of course, the CO2 is much, much less dense within the overall gas. So you need a far bigger amount of equipment to capture it. And even more so with direct air capture, where you're sucking in the general atmosphere, and the CO2 is only a relatively small part of that. So those processes have instinctively and inherently a much higher cost than the process of capturing CO2 when it's coming from biogenic biogas and is being turned into biomethane. So those two key takeaways, I think, come out very clearly from the modeling exercise, the role of green gas in net zero, and have some really important consequences. Because if you can actually capture CO2 very cheaply by comparison with other means, you create room within the net zero system to persist with a load of much more difficult, hard to abate uses, which mean that you can save an awful lot of money there too. So there are two really big fundamental reasons why this modeling exercise shows that if you put biomethane into the whole energy system, you're saving money, both because of the dispatchability and therefore saving money on the overbuilding, particularly of intermittent renewables, but you're also saving money because of the ability to capture carbon so cheaply. So I wanted to just start off by saying those are two key messages for me in this report. And I'm now going to kick over to Gareth, who's going to spell out some of the really other important messages in what I think has been a really fruitful and interesting report with a lot of insights into how we should do the transition to the net zero. Gareth.
Thanks, Chris. I will endeavour to share my screen effectively, and we will see how that works. For those of you who are observant, you'll notice that Craig and myself have swapped faces during the time between creating our images and turning up to this presentation. Is that visible? Chris, can you see my screen?
Absolutely. Yes, I
can. And you see
slides? I can see slides, but I can also, it's not on full view. I can see, you know, the sidebars and things, but not notes.
Let's try that one again.
Yes, now full view, perfect.
Okay, let's try it this way. I can't see what I can see.
That looks fine, Gareth. You're all right.
Okay. All right.
Zoe Booth just asking, will the slides be shared after? Gareth, do you have any problems? I think we can probably share slides. I think what I should
share some. Yeah.
Yeah, what I should perhaps have said in housekeeping is that everybody is invited for free entry to the expo at the National Exhibition Centre this coming week, Wednesday and Thursday, and there will be copies of the report available there for people to pick up. And if you can't do that, you can go on the ADBA website and you will be able to download a PDF. And I think pretty much all of the slides that Gareth is going to go through will be in the actual report, the PDF. Maybe some of the others, but
we can share a version of this. Okay, so we'll try and have a quick canter through this. So a little bit of background. Anaerobic digestion in the UK is a relatively well-established method of producing primarily energy. Currently, we're split into around 600 plants that take the gas from the biodigesters, which can be filled with any kind of organic matter, really. And as Chris said, using a biological process, breaks that down to produce methane and some CO2 at the same time. Let's say about 600 of those AD plants are producing electricity directly from burning the biogas in what they call a combined heat and power unit on site. And then about another 130 or so are producing biomethane, where you take the CO2 from the biogas, take that away to one side. A lot of places vent it, some places capture it, and then inject biomethane directly into the gas grid. We've got there through a range of policy methods over the years, starting from the renewable obligation certificates and feed-in tariffs for the electricity side of things, which starts us back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and then transitioning progressively through what's called the renewable heat incentive, which supported the injection of biomethane into the grid for the first time, and on to now where we have what's called the green gas support scheme, which is a follow-on scheme to the renewable heat incentive. And if you look at the way things have changed, you can see that basically there is a chart following the policy. When people have demand for AD plants, they build them, and they build what the policy supports. So initially it was building a lot of biogas plants, and then about 8-10 years ago, it starts to transition into mostly producing biomethane plants. Some of those are on using wastewater sewage plants, and some of those are crop, other waste, other organic matter streams. And what we've seen is that the biomethane capacity for injection has gone up steadily over time. And our focus has been moving ever more to the gas output. Starting in 2010, we have a little bit of biomethane being injected into the grid. And then as of last year, end of last year, we're at a little bit under 8 terawatt hours of biomethane being injected into the gas grid, which is a sizable amount. Now, the policy framework, as I said, is what's driven it. The green gas support scheme's been a little bit stop-start, and so there's a lot of stuff in the pipeline that hasn't yet come about. Over the next 3-4 years, we're expecting to see somewhere in the region of another 3 or 4 terawatt hours come on the gas grid. These are sites that have been approved and are ready to go forward, and each one of those, as Chris has said earlier, has the ability to take the CO2 and put it to one side. So we're talking about maybe 11 terawatt hours in 2027, 2028 of gas injection. What does that convert into? Well, the UK currently uses around 700 terawatt hours of gas every year. Those are figures from 2023 from DESNZ. And that's a big chunk of energy. To put it in context, that's roughly, well, it's a little bit over double what the electricity grid produces in a given year. And of that, we mostly use it for domestic heating and electricity generation. It does get used in a lot of other things, but those are the two big use cases. Industrial heat is another one. That's our next biggest one. And then there are, a little bit in agriculture, a little bit in, public administration is a bit of a catch-all category. But you can see we're up to just under 500, well, just over 500 terawatt hours of our gas is used between electricity generation, domestic heating, so your hot water and radiators at home mostly, and electricity production. Now, if there is a transition as the policies are set up to move domestic heating more to electricity, that increases the demand for electricity by quite a lot, several terawatt hours a year, but reduces the total energy required for it. So these things end up being an interesting comparison balance. So we've talked a little bit about the AD and what happens to the gas, what happens to the energy from it. What do we think is the future? This brings us to the question that Chris and I asked, and Craig and the rest of the team at BMA helped us try to answer, which is, let's try and look at it as a whole system rather than just focusing entirely on the energy. Why do we care about biomethane? Well, the UK has a commitment to decarbonise. It's in law. We've got these carbon budgets, which hopefully you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there. And these are committing. By CB6, we'll only have 382 megatons. We'll only have 200-ish megatons of CO2 a year available to emit. And that is, that's quite a lot less than we've got at the moment. It's not abundantly clear how we get there with a great deal of spare capacity. As I said, gas makes up approximately twice as much energy in the UK mix as electricity. And so with the need to halve our carbon emissions and move a lot more things to electricity or something that's zero carbon, we have to take things very seriously. Biomethane, being an organic matter-based product, only cycles carbon in a relatively short cycle. Any carbon that's emitted from the biomethane combustion was in the atmosphere within the last 18 months. So you can treat it as basically carbon neutral. There are some process emissions in there. I know at least one of you on this call understands what process emissions are. So it's one of those things that allows you to not put up your carbon emissions while still moving energy around the system. If we can displace 30 terawatt hours, so a little, that's a bit under 1% extra of the total gas input at the moment, then that displaces 6 megatons of CO2 per year. That's worth having. If we then capture the CO2 from the production of that biomethane, it's another 4 megatons, gets us to 10, which is just about 5% of the carbon budget 6 total emissions. These sound not big until you start to stack it up in terms of where we need to get. Today, they're relatively small numbers. Where we need to be in 2035, they're starting to be quite meaningful. And they're deliverable today. So we took that understanding and had a long, complicated series of conversations with BMA involving digging into an awful lot of data. And ultimately, the sleepless nights and long days in the office culminated in this, I think, rather decent report. I'm pretty happy with it. I think Chris is reasonably happy with it, and I'm pretty sure Craig's fairly happy with it. Trying to summarize what does going seriously on biomethane mean? Now, we've got the carbon budgets. This is part of the output of the model, which tries to say, what is the carbon budget as modeled today going forward? This is based on what the National Energy Systems Operator, as they now are, produced as their pathways to net zero future energy scenarios. I think these are the 2023 versions. They're due to publish a new one in about 3 weeks' time, which we hope will take on board some of the findings from this study. And this tries to break it down by the different sectors. So you can see there's emissions from all kinds of different sectors: domestic heat, transport, electricity generation, and all of those have to be accounted for. The beauty of the BMA model was that it allowed us to model the impact and to optimize a solution for the UK based on changing the input assumptions. Now, why do we need to change the input assumptions? Well, the original NESO, FES, PNZ, whichever you want to call it, treats biomethane as natural gas because, for all intents and purposes, it is. You put it into the gas grid in the same way, you burn it in the same way. Got the same applications, it just doesn't have the carbon footprint. So we wanted to see what happens when you take that seriously. But also, if you look below that, that chart, you can see there are some negative figures because there's a need for carbon removals in every version of carbon budgets. And this is one of the unique attributes that we think is brought to the table by biomethane because of this dual impact. There's actually more than two, but we're just focusing on two impacts here, which is displacement of existing fossil methane and the opportunity for carbon removals. And so there is the summary, starting from the end, working back through the detail. By introducing biomethane, not only do we reduce the overall carbon emissions above the line, but we increase significantly the amount of carbon removals below the line across the whole system, which means that we can get to that net zero figure in 2050. And the important point here is net. We are focusing on getting to net zero, and we do it in a slightly different way. And we're going to dig into the background of that as I womble through this. So summary figures. The model from BMA has the ability to look at the overall costs of the system and to choose what to do. We gave it a number of key scenarios. One was duplicating pathway to net zero as the FES existed. That has a cost, that's our baseline. Then we had a very low biomethane scenario, which is the numbers that come from the government biomass strategy, which is a very lowball 35 terawatt hours. We arrived at an estimate based on our best understanding of what was available at the time of about 100 terawatt hours availability of biomethane. And there is another estimate out there, a very ambitious one from Ecotricity, the energy supply company, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, which came up with roughly 288 terawatt hours, which is definitely punchy. It's probably deliverable. Is it economic or wise? That's another question, but it's definitely an interpretation. Anyway, so we ran this through the BMA model and arrived at even delivering the low government estimate provided a very significant saving over the course of net zero. 3.8% from the total cost of net zero, £154 billion, which is a meaningful number. It's I think we can all agree that if we found that down the back of the sofa, we'd be feeling pretty happy about it. When we hit the ADBA sort of central estimate, 100 terawatt hours, actually it's close to £300 billion saving. Now you'll notice that it's not double the saving. It's not double the amount of biomethane that delivers that saving. We're hitting one of those optimization points in the system. So it's getting to a good position. But actually, when you start to push it too far, we end up in a position where we actually save less by going to more biomethane. So somewhere in there's a sweet spot. And we'll possibly touch on some of those implications, but I'm going to womble on to the next set of information. So this is new data. This is new since the last time we presented this, which is the output of the first part of a publicly available report into feedstock availability. We had, to say, some decent estimates of how much feedstock was available, but this is a much more detailed look at it, done by a company called All the Bio Insights. Some of you may have known them previously as NNFCC, but very competent people, and probably the premier experts on biofuel feedstocks in the UK. And so we have this estimate from them, which actually says that 2050, 120 terawatt hours is plausible. And so we weren't overestimating it. In fact, we were possibly being a bit conservative for our modeling work, which is Always nice to know. So I'm going to just make this clear. One of the things that we have to bear in mind is that different energy vectors have different costs. This is a chart, a table of some figures developed related to the model based on what is the levelized cost of energy. It's a method of measurement beloved of certain government departments, which in theory tells you what you should be building. Now, it is heavily skewed by the operational costs, which means that for certain things, they look quite cheap. Solar, wind. On that basis, you should be building more of those. And actually, you probably should. But you also see the costs of gas-powered electricity with CCUS. So that's the post-combustion carbon capture that Chris was talking about at the top. They're more than double the costs of, or roughly double the costs of biomethane. But we're proposing to build quite a lot of these in order to provide that dispatchable power for the UK grid. That sounds like that might not be such a good idea if we look at these numbers. There's other issues. As Chris said, there are certain things that you can't do with electricity. It's quite hard to store, but actually even moving it around the system is a lot more expensive than gas. Plastic is cheap, air is free, copper is neither of those things. So if you want to move an amount of energy around the system, it's a lot easier to do it through a pipe if it's available in that format. Some fairly rough and ready, but defensible calculations. A normal 10 centimeter diameter gas pipe running past your house will be able to deliver around 1300 kilowatt hours, 1300 kilowatts per hour of energy to your area. Same amount of copper is actually only able to deliver up to 320 kilowatts. So if you want to move energy fast, gas is your friend. Also, it's cheap. 12 to 25 pounds a meter for the gas pipe, approximately double that for copper cable. So the cost of energy distribution per kilowatt hour is significantly lower for gas. And this is some of the things that starts to come out of the BMA modeling. The other thing is actually the carbon emissions of the infrastructure. It's a lot lower for plastic cable than a copper, a plastic pipe than a copper cable. Storage. Now, one of the things that we make the savings from the BMA model is energy storage. If you're focusing on batteries as your energy storage, this image here is 75 megawatt hours of battery storage, New South Wales, Australia. 300 million pounds roughly per gigawatt hour of storage. Significant, it's a meaningful amount of storage. This is Chris's favorite site in the world, which is the Rough offshore gas storage facility in the UK, storing 30 terawatt hours of gas. That costs roughly 60 million pounds per terawatt hour. That is roughly 1/5000th the cost for storing the gas as for storing the electricity. So when we start to swing over to storing gas versus storing electricity, we make savings. How big an impact can that make? Well, we're talking 120 terawatt hours of biomethane. As we said at the beginning, that's not replacing 100% of the gas that we're using at the moment. But is it a big number? Well, again, the BMA model was able to stack that with various nuclear investment scenarios those based on existing policy and those optimized by the model. And under all those scenarios, we ended up with a biomethane utilization rate that was approximately the same as nuclear. So if we think nuclear is a big number, if we think nuclear is significant, then we think biomethane is significant. You can't say one is important and the other isn't. Obviously, we would also say that you've got to look at the co-benefits of the biomethane, particularly that CO2 capture, but there are others. Then we've got heating, beloved of everybody. Standard FES scenario as it was involves, policy derived ramp down, and that was actually taking us to basically zero gas heating in 2050, simply because that's what the policy said we were going to do. If we optimize it, again, it's biomethane. So we have the brown line here at the bottom, which is our biomethane component in the gas grid, and the blue bars there, which are the residual natural gas. Then what we have is still a very significant increase in electricity-based heating. It's not a loser, but the biomethane allows a cheaper transition to a lower carbon net zero domestic heat landscape, because we have that carbon capture associated with the biomethane, but we're also reducing the carbon intensity of all the gas that's in the gas grid. We still get to net zero, we do it in a different way, and we still end up with a fairly electricity dominated mix. Interestingly, what we choose not to do with the model in this situation is not so much removal of electrical domestic heating, but heat networks, because heat networks are expensive. You have to dig up a lot of land and you have to install a lot of infrastructure that's not already there. And this is one of those things that biomethane enables us to make different decisions on. And then we can look at transport fuels. And we're only looking here at heavy transport, so basically trucks, not vans. Cars and vans are a different thing. We're assuming cars and vans go completely or predominantly electric. In the original FES scenario, again, this went all electric, but the availability of biomethane to offset the carbon emissions of residual diesel usage actually meant that we don't go completely electric. Electric vans, electric trucks currently are around about 2 to 3 times the cost of a diesel truck. And so that is a big infrastructure cost. It's a big system cost. It's something that you don't necessarily want to do. As we looked at briefly, if you want to reinforce the electricity supply so that you can charge a truck, you need approximately a megawatt to charge it in a reasonable time frame. A megawatt is a lot of copper, and it is going to cost a lot of money to install. If you can get enough energy to do that for a lot of trucks. So anything that can move something that's energy dense to a truck to get it moving quickly is cheaper, basically. And that's what the model throws out. So ultimately, we've got a policy landscape which has built out some biomethane. We haven't maximized our opportunities. We are getting better, we are producing more, but we haven't actually incentivized all of the things that can be done. Particularly, we haven't actually incentivized any of the carbon capture side of things. Now, since we produced this report, we have been fortunate enough to see the first unsubsidized biomethane plant launched in the UK, which was launched by Future Biogas to supply energy to AstraZeneca and also capture that CO2 from the biomethane production, ultimately for sequestration. That's intended to go into long-term storage. In the short run, it's going into the food and drink sector because there's demand for it. But when they can, as soon as they can, that's the going to start going to long-term storage to give them carbon negative energy. So there's a commercial incentive to do it, but the government hasn't yet decided to do that. And what we were trying to show up, to surface with this discussion, with this report, was the opportunity to save money, to generate low carbon energy, and to actually generate the buffer of negative emissions that every scenario says we need, but is not yet available through any government incentive mechanism. We're in a position where if we did deploy that carbon capture on the existing biomethane injection stock, we could be saving around a megaton of CO2 a year already. That's roughly 1 million transatlantic passenger journeys both ways, which is not nothing. I think the airline industry would have your arm off for that. So that's where we are. We're in a position where we've got a significant opportunity to make the best of what's in front of us. We're not saying we're a magic bullet, but we definitely have the ability to make a dent, and a fairly big dent at that. And with that, I will endeavour to stop sharing and hand back to Chris.
Thank you very much, Gareth. Good run through of where we are and what the industry can do. I think there are perhaps a couple of things to add in before we hand over to Craig. One, it's perhaps a good way of thinking about it. I come at this as an economist, Gareth, with a different background. So this is very much, and Craig, IT, so this is very much a multidisciplinary exercise.
It's a team
effort.
But
if you're asking yourself, why is it that you're saving this sort of money, and yet when you have that ecotricity scenario, why do you start saving less money? Well, in economics, if you exploit all the really clever, cheap opportunities first, they then start getting more expensive. And if you push anything too far, you end up going up the cost curve. So your costs rise and you're having to exploit more and more difficult and more expensive options. So there is a sweet spot, as Gareth said, for biomethane. It's somewhere around that middling case where you maximize the opportunity, but we're not saying maximize biomethane output, whatever the cost, because that's not the name of the game. And by the way, the same reasoning applies to the savings that are being made on intermittent renewables, particularly offshore wind. You don't need to overbuild as much offshore wind. You don't need to go so far up the cost curve in order to if you've put biomethane into the whole energy system. So it's that rising cost curve when you've exploited all the obvious things, and then you have to get into the more difficult ones, the more expensive ones. That's a lot of actually what is going on in the in the modelling here. So
Chris, we've got some questions. Do we want to save the questions for the end, or do we want to tackle them here?
I think we should perhaps save them until we've heard Craig, if that's all right.
Fantastic.
Craig may
that sounds great to me. Yeah.
Some of those. And then we'll come back to any questions that people have got. Craig, over to you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Gareth. Let me try and share my screen first. Oh, share. Okay. Is that coming through? National Energy System?
Yep.
Fabulous.
Yep.
So, yes, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Gareth. Yeah, this was a fascinating project to be working on from our perspective. As Chris said, we're sort of coming from a modeling, planning, optimization perspective. We are not energy experts. We're certainly not biomethane experts. It was all about it's just the data and applying the maths from our perspective. So a little bit of context on the tool we used, and then we'll dive into the kind of the outputs and some of the insights. So we have this whole energy system modeling tool on our cloud platform, a planning tool we have called Decisio, Cloud for Energy Transition is the energy tool. This had been built a couple of years ago through work with a number of stakeholders, including National Grid, Northern Gas Networks, Northern Power Grid, and then including the NESO, the National Energy System Operator, and so on, to create a whole energy system, multi-energy vector planning tool to kind of break through planning energy in silos, plan for electricity, plan for gas, etc., pull it all together. So that's what we had, and then working with the ADBA, with Chris and Gareth, we built in biomethane into that tool as well. As I guess to our shame, we sort of followed on from what was in VES, and we just had natural gas, not differentiating. So that was the enhancement to the underlying tool that allowed us to run these scenarios, which you've seen some of the insights from. So if we kind of take you through a little bit of what this tool is and the process, underpinning all our tools, which are all in the kind of infrastructure, networked asset planning space, is what we call a value chain, or a digital business twin, which is what you see on the right, which captures the end-to-end processes and activities that occur in this particular industry. So in terms of move the Zoom thing out of the way, which you probably can't see. In terms of this energy tool, this is the high-level value chain sitting behind it, with this broadly sources of energy on the left, moving through sort of generation, transmission, storage, distribution, to on the right-hand side where you have the different high-level demand blocks or demand types for energy. So this is what allows the latter analysis, the scenario analysis, the optimization, to understand how things functionally relate to each other. So I, want to supply more electricity or biomethane to meet some demand here. I therefore have to have this storage, distribution, this transmission, this generation in order to do that. So it's always looking at the whole system and not making any decisions in isolation. Another quick point is that this tool, if you sort of look at the table on the left as I drill down into domestic electricity demand, for instance, this tool, as we used it here for this analysis, is entirely built on publicly available data. So you've got that complete transparency. So on the left, sorry, is popping up which publicly available sources of data were used to configure each element of that energy value chain. So it's all transparent based on publicly available data, which is important. So once we've got that value chain, biomethane was added as part of that value chain. Just very, very briefly, without going into too much detail, but you get a sense of what's behind some of the numbers that we shared with you. Start my timer. Make sure I don't go on for too long. We've got overlaid to that value chain. We put on the real, the assets, the network, as well as future assets, the geospatial specific information. So we represent demand across these 370 GSP zones across the country. So we've got that, can have some of that regional variation across the country. We overlay on that, the network assets that connect up those different demand zones, because we ultimately balance energy supply demand at a national level, not at a local or regional level. So that's the gas transmission network that's represented in the tool, the electricity transmission assets. So we've got the demand, we've got the networks connecting demand to then supplies, bring in the supply assets. These are some of the renewable sources of energy and so on and so forth. It'll get very complicated if I show everything on the map, or too crowded rather. But we have that, that end-to-end representation of the whole GB energy system within the tool, which we can then start to run scenarios on. So in this case, we were pairing this with an optimization engine to run optimization scenarios. So in this case, we're setting it with an objective function of achieving net zero by 2050. You sort of see towards the bottom left where I'm wiggling my cursor, and to do so for a minimum cost. So further up, right, there's a minimum cost. There's various other constraints to make it behave itself. Primarily, though, there's a carbon constraint, carbon budget per year, so it follows the annual carbon budgets. But in broad terms, we're using the optimization to ask it to find a way to achieve net zero by 2050 and all the annual carbon budgets up to that point for least cost. To do so, it's obviously got to transform the existing energy system. The energy system as it is now is not net zero. The only way it can do so is making investment decisions. It just can't magically change the energy system. We give it investment options, small and large, across generation, transmission, distribution, and demand, that it can choose to make at a cost, at a capex and opex cost, a capital cost and operating cost, to achieve net zero, and then that gives us the cost of achieving net zero. So that we won't read through these, but you can sort of get a sense of the number of different investment options that we're giving it. So there's sort of hundreds of these different investment options, well 3,700 in total, and that's the raw material that the optimizer is working with. Which of these investments should I choose, when and where, to find that least cost pathway to net zero? Working with the ADBA, we added in investment options for around biomethane, both in terms of sources of biomethane, but also capturing the process emissions, and also carbon capture at end use at combustion as well. So that's what we fed into the machine, as it were. Then in terms of now looking at the outputs coming out the other end. We'll jump maybe here. So coming out the other end, we'll go to the counterfactual scenario to start with. We get a pathway to net zero at a certain cost. So this is the counterfactual, the future energy scenario produced by the NESO in 2024. The holistic transition one is the one that we focused on, sort of more balanced transition to net zero. So you'll see here that this is where we've constrained our tool to largely reflect that future energy scenario, fill in some of the blanks, but where we can, it's constrained to that future energy scenario. On the right, you've got the demand that's met. On the left, the sources of energy to meet that demand. So it's kind of a mass balance we're looking at here. And I'll pick up some of the differences that Gareth mentioned as well. So you'll see here, to meet, we're on domestic heat demand. To meet domestic heat demand in the FES scenario, you'll see these orange blocks here called waste heat. That's heat through heat networks used to meet domestic demand. If we now go to the 100 terawatt hour scenario with 100 terawatt hours of biomethane, you'll see that that's reduced quite a bit. So there, what the tool is doing is, because it can supply that biomethane through existing infrastructure, through existing gas networks, it's choosing to do that rather than building new infrastructure, new heat works and so heat networks, because it's getting a saving in doing that. I realized I skipped a step I hadn't meant to go through, which will show you the profile of biomethane growth. So at the bottom here, in this scenario, you'll see in terawatt hours, the amount of biomethane that's produced and going into the gas grid, reaching 100 terawatt hours in 2050. This is the scenario I'm going to focus on as we go through. So you see it's a fairly steady growth. There's a little sort of peak coming up to around 2030, and then a fairly steady growth. So it's the solution. The model likes it because it's largely using existing infrastructure, and therefore doesn't need investment, incur cost in new infrastructure. One of the other differences that we can see on this view here is around hydrogen production. So we go back to the counterfactual. At the top histogram, you're looking at the production of hydrogen by technology. So this sort of teal color is production of hydrogen through electrolysis. You're taking green electricity and using that to produce hydrogen through electrolysis. And then this brown one at the top is thermal production of hydrogen, so-called blue hydrogen. We're using natural gas to make hydrogen and capturing the carbon at that point. By introducing a lot more biomethane, we see that the model now no longer chooses to make biomethane through electrolysis using green electricity. And the reason we sort of had to think, why is it doing that? The reason it's doing that is now because it's got the biomethane, which gives you that dispatchable, storable, flexible source of energy. It doesn't need hydrogen to fulfill that role, in sort of hard to abate in things like industry and so on. It uses biomethane for that role. And then it prefers then to use that green electricity directly and not have the losses when you convert that into hydrogen. So that, the model to make the energy system work, you need a certain amount of dispatchable generation, and it's choosing biomethane as its preferred kind of source of dispatchable generation over blue hydrogen, thermally produced hydrogen. So if we go deeper into the biomethane results, this is a page here, all kind of focusing on how the model is using the biomethane in that 100 terawatt-hour scenario. We can see at the top a breakdown of how the biomethane is used. So in 2050, when we get to the full 100 terawatt hours, we see there's a large proportion on domestic heat. So if you think about older properties, more remote rural properties, where heat pumps and so on are not necessarily suitable, biomethane is being used there. You've got some for industrial commercial heat, and then industrial use. So we do see the hydrogen, the biomethane displacing hydrogen for some of that hard to abate industrial use, for electricity generation, and then finally for producing hydrogen as well. So there's a range of uses for the models using biomethane for a range of uses. You'll see on the bottom here what Gareth pointed out, the middle right there, what Gareth pointed out around the sort of retained use of liquid fossil fuels, primarily diesel, I guess, for industrial and commercial transport. So if you keep your eyes on that graph, if I flick to the counterfactual scenario here, you'll see that in the counterfactual and in the future energy scenario, both industrial commercial transport in that graph in the middle of the right had gone almost entirely to been entirely electrified, that light green color, and all those black liquid fossil fuels had completely been phased out. Largely the same for the domestic transport on the left. But then with the biomethane, with the greater biomethane available, you'll see that it sort of retains a much higher sort of level of this. There's a large degree of electrification of industrial commercial transport, but quite a bit of liquid fossil fuels left. Now, you don't have to do this. You could still choose to drive electrification of industrial commercial transport. But what this is saying to sort of us as a modeler is there's now a lot more sort of flexibility and headroom, in a sense, on how you achieve net zero. The fact that you don't have to electrify I&C transport completely because you've got that biomethane gives you that, you've got a lot more headroom, wiggle room in how you achieve net zero. So if another part of your kind of transition to net zero doesn't perform as well as you thought, or is more difficult than you thought, you've got some wiggle room here, and you can pursue more aggressive electrification of I&C transport, which in this sort of long-term planning, that kind of flexibility and resilience is very useful to have. And to illustrate that a little bit more, if we look at the carbon emissions, and just make sure we're on the right scenarios. All right, so on the histogram at the top, on the top right, you've got the carbon emissions associated with the 100 terawatt hours biomethane scenario. And on the bottom, you've got that same graph, but for the counterfactual scenario, the holistic transition future energy scenario in the bottom. The way to interpret this graph is that this is your emission, your sort of net emissions around carbon for each year going out from 2023 up to 2050. Everything above the zero line is positive emissions to the atmosphere. Everything below the zero line is either captured carbon or negative emissions. So you're looking by 2050 that you've got at least as much below the line as you have above the line. So you're net zero or better. So you'll see that in the both achieve net zero, but you'll see that in the biomethane scenario at the top, there's a lot more below the line. So there's a lot more captured negative emissions in that final net zero position, which sort of illustrates what the biomethane's doing in terms of, sort of in terms of optimization, because it gives you all that negative emissions. It gives you much more choice and flexibility in terms of how you decarbonize other parts of the energy system, allowing you to choose lower cost options, or less risky, more flexible options. So in a way, I'm sure Chris and Gareth will say there's lots of other reasons for using biomethane, lots of good things about biomethane, but from a purely kind of least cost optimization to net zero point of view, it's really those negative emissions that it gives you, that then gives you other choices around the energy system, that makes one of the big differences, as well as being that dispatchable source of energy, which is always appealing, and you need a certain amount. So I'll pause there and to take a time check. How are we doing for time? Shall I go on for 5 or more minutes, or I covered the main points?
Yes,
I think here comfortably.
No, go. We've got some questions to get to, so a few more minutes will be fine, Craig.
Yeah, okay, I can do that. So I was just going to touch on the cost, really, to finish. We've talked a lot about the sort of carbon impact and what it's doing to the energy system. In terms of cost, to come back to those investment decisions, so you saw that coming into the going into this scenario, there was lots and lots of investment decisions given to the model, more than it could possibly choose or afford to choose, given that we do give it sort of budget constraints. So here we're looking at the investment decisions chosen by the model. So you've got a list of the investment decisions, then going across the columns when that investment's made, and in the cells the amount of that investment, and then in the map where those investments are, so we can see what sort of investments have been made in electricity, in terms of hydrogen, and so on, and where they are. So this is what underpins the cost and those cost savings that Gareth went to, is this quite detailed temporal spatial investment plan, and then that's what builds up the cost. We can see that sort of net cost through time, so you have a sense of the spend profile both in capex and opex here for the 100 terawatt hours ADBA scenario, and then for the counterfactual as well that we're comparing it to, so you can both see the total cost and the profile of that cost through time. And then in the OPEX and CAPEX comparisons, we are the right scenario selected. You can see where the cost savings are coming from. There's savings being made around energy storage and electricity transmission in terms of operational maintenance costs. And then CAPEX wise, we are the right scenario again. You can see where the capex, you can drill down to where the capex savings are coming from. So there's someone avoiding some hydrogen for heating costs. There's some big ones on electricity, avoiding having to reinforce the electricity transmission network, and so on. So you can see where those capex savings are coming from, and kind of drill down then into individual investments and so on. Underpinning those, there's quite a lot of detail underpinning the costs, and these can be updated and refined as those change, and so on, as we move through delivery in a sense of net zero by 2050. I'll stop there, if that's okay then.
Craig, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. I think that gives a real sense of the richness of the model's capacity to actually give you some really granular local data, as well as a whole energy system view. I'm going to come to questions. I want to ask one other question, because for Craig, and perhaps you should just explain the way in which the model is effectively estimated, because you're using AI in order to find relationships, aren't you? And that doesn't always make it so easy to know as it used to be back in the old days, when you were modeling the economy. You would estimate a particular equation for consumption, whatever it happened to be, being a result of incomes and perhaps wealth and other factors. Could you just tell us a little bit about this, how the model reaches its view of relationships?
So the relationships and investment options coming in are generated in a number of ways. Some using sort of predictive modeling and AI, particularly in the generation of investment options. When we come to the optimization, once you've got those relationships, once you've got those investment options, when you come to the optimization, the least cost optimization, that's pure mathematical optimization. That's completely transparent and repeatable. There's no sort of AI or black boxes there. But yeah, on the relationships and sort of investment options, sort of data inside of things, we sort of found sort of many years ago there was a big limitation in optimization planning tools generally in the sector, in that there weren't enough options being given to them. And you can have the smartest optimizer in the world, but if you only give it a couple of options to choose from, it doesn't have much to choose from. You're not going to get a very good answer. So that's so we're using predictive modeling and AI to generate the options and generate the relationships. But then you've got to make sure that they're reasonable and so on. So there's been a lot of work going in, to validate the relationships and so on in this tool after we've sort of identified them. So we worked with a number of energy sort of experts and consultancies, Progressive Energy for one, KPMG to validate those relationships and so on. So I'm going into the model,
Yeah.
but we found that's having, if you think of optimization as a big funnel, having as many options as you can and relationships identified to then narrow down to find the optimal is worth it. But when you get to the optimization, it's transparent at that point. And
that's great. Thanks. I mean, I should also just add, for those who don't know, that BMA is being used by some big names. I don't know whether how much you're allowed to talk about your clients or whether they're actually public or not, but a number of household names would be using BMA to model their bit of the energy system and opportunities within it. So I think that this is a really useful tool. I'm going to now come to the questions. We've got 13 and some very good ones. And we're going to try and answer these as much as possible live. But if we don't get to everybody before the session has to close, then we'll try and come back to you with a written answer. Adam Mann asks about the modelling for biomethane feedstocks, and I'm going to summarise that because John Henry Looney asks a similar question, which is, when you look at the feedstocks, okay, Gareth, over to you. This is what I would call, looking back at the politics of this, the so-called food versus fuel debate. Are we, by using a load more biomethane, and it is true that all the BioInsights modeling of feedstocks does suggest a lot of the increase is coming out of energy crops in agriculture. So does this necessarily mean that we are going to have less food? And I would say very firmly, Lucy Hopwood, who led the study for NNFCC, now Alder BioInsights, was given the very strict remit of sticking within existing sustainability rules. But Gareth, you've done a lot of work on this, so why don't you?
Well, I've spent a lot of time going through stuff with Lucy on
more
it as
food
well.
or less food?
No less food, probably slightly more food.
Right.
So this is entirely predicated on no conversion of land away from food to crops for energy, as distinct from energy crops. Energy crops tend to be perennial, permanent, woody, lignocellulosic things that you burn for energy. Crops for energy are alternative use cases. So in the case of the rotational crops that are listed, then that is a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 7 rotation with probably wheat mostly. The majority of that will be wheat production, as it is in a lot of places at the moment. And then putting in as I say, 1 in 5, 1 in 7 break crop to break the cycle of accumulation of pests to that wheat crop, reduce the needs for pesticides, herbicides, and allow a certain amount of regeneration for the crop. There's also a significant amount of sequential cropping in that feedstock assumption. which is something that's not done enough in this country, honestly. In a good scenario, what you're going to do with that is put a winter-ish crop in so that you never have a bare soil. So if you can reduce the amount of bare soil exposed by 30%, you'll reduce the loss of sediment to overland flow. So when it rains and the water runs off the surface, by about 50%. So you want those sequential cover crops to keep the soil in condition over the winter, but you're also not going to grow those until they're completely finished. So one of the things that's very popular for that is rye. And so you grow rye, don't get it all the way to harvest standard. You cut it early, and then that finds its way into the AD because it's about the best thing to do with it. And then you bring in your wheat crop behind that. So in all of these scenarios, we're looking at definitely no conversion of land away from food, which is in contrast to the proposal coming from DEFRA. And we are probably looking at an increase in yields by better crop management. And there's also the whole nutrient cycling argument from AD that we're staying away from that because we're trying to stay focused in this session. So I think,
yep.
Short answer.
Let's leave it at that, because I think we're going to certainly. Gareth has done some tremendous work on this, and there's also a long list of peer-reviewed articles to back up those assertions. This will mean no less food. It may mean even more food because of better management of soils through rotation and sequencing. So I think that is the shorthand answer to Adam Mann's question and to John Henry Looney's first question. So I'm going to leave it there, but we will be coming back to this, no doubt, in separate webinars to go into some of the detail. John Henry Looney asks, we import significant methane annually and a reasonable amount of frack gas from the US. How do you improve this, particularly with green UK gas? Well, this is absolutely fundamental, that this is a entirely homegrown energy source. So it is entirely substituting for imports. Every single extra bit of biomethane produced in the UK cuts the import need for fossil gas through LNG or through the Norwegian pipeline. And so there's a straightforward one-for-one. And by the way, there's an extra economic, not only is there an energy security benefit from that, but there's also an extra economic benefit, because if you're spending money at home, it has a higher propensity to boost the economy than if you're spending money on imports, where obviously may be very good for gas producers in West Texas, but not very good for biogas producers through the rest of the UK. So the very fact that you're producing a homegrown energy source, I think, is really important part of the messaging. And DESNES produced some interesting work quite recently showing that if you expand the biogas sector, the plants tend to get built in poorer areas of the country. So there's also a leveling up element to this. You get homegrown energy, you get it built all over the country, because the agricultural areas and indeed the waste products that can be used in AD are available all over the country. And the plants are often in poorer areas and therefore help with leveling up. John Henry Looney, again, we have a idea on, he likes the idea of the storage of green gas to generate when wind and solar are not meeting the UK's requirements. If we move to mainly electric and with heat pumps, the 400 terawatt hours of gas for heating could become 100 terawatt hours of electricity at a copper-4. So green gas as a backup could make a significant contribution. Please comment on my, I think my comment is good point, and we agree. Gareth, do you want to add anything?
Not really. See, it's a reasonable interpretation. There's obviously some transmission and conversion losses, but I think for a lot of situations, it makes sense.
Yeah. The next question we've got is Cato Sanford, who's got quite a few coming up here. Cato asks, in your estimating of available biomethane, did you consider, I assume you mean, Cato, methane leakage at different stages of the supply chain? Now, this is something we've done and are continuing to do a lot of work on in ADBA. And indeed, the government has highlighted cases where we've had methane leakage. And the extraordinary thing is that despite the fact that, if methane leaks out of an AD plant because it's not being well run or hasn't been well maintained, that is a straightforward loss to the bottom line of the owner of that AD plant. Despite that, the government found one plant that was losing about 500 to 600,000 pounds a year through methane leakage. So this is something that the industry is treating very seriously. It's sort of nuts that any of this is happening. And we have a scheme in ADBA called the AD certification scheme, which is designed to improve the performance of those plants that are not as well run as they should be. And methane leakage is absolutely key. That we're trying to stop methane leakage is absolutely key. And our technical team, very ably led by Andrew Brown, the ADBA side, has very clearly set out to members of the potential losses here, and we're getting a renewed amount of interest in making sure that that this is not happening. But you're absolutely right that when it comes to methane leakage, we need to be top of the game, and we have every incentive to be top of the game. Anybody want to add anything more to that? Gareth, no. Okay, well let's go on to that. Cato says, what kind of assumptions did you make about the rate of construction of new facilities and hence the production capacity expansion? Good point, because we're talking about a really big expansion of the sector, and all I would say is that we did impose effectively a check on reality by looking back at the fastest period of expansion of the sector in the past, which was in the wake of the renewable heat incentive. We had a 5-year period when the sector was expanding by more than 20% a year. It can be done. The International Energy Agency has recently just produced a report on global expansion of biomethane, which is, most of the arguments we're talking about apply absolutely everywhere, whether it is France, Brazil, India, Indonesia. We've just had a Swiss firm announce a large investment in sustainable biogas production in Indonesia, which is why that came up into my head. And if you can grow the whole sector by that much globally, then we can certainly do the same in the UK and do it again, because we've already done it. And we have a number of big, interesting, pioneering businesses in the sector who are doing exciting things on, for example, the carbon capture side, which means that not only can we expand the sector very rapidly within the UK, but we can provide learnings which will give business opportunities for the UK overseas as the sector expands globally. Nithin Rai, thank you. What proportion of the crop feedstock is agricultural waste? How do you forecast? I think we've dealt with
We've done that one. Yeah.
that. The second question is really, was that the rough gas storage picture that you shared? And roughly, how does the cost compare with underground storage on land? Well, we don't have any underground storage on land at the moment, although there has been, as you may know, the UK is the worst served country in Western Europe for gas storage. Rough has been the only long-term gas storage facility, and even the Treasury actually made DESNZ close that down, and it's been brought back. So we've got a long way to catch up before we get to the sort of levels of gas storage that exist on the continent. One of the geological sites that's been identified for good gas storage on land are the salt caverns in the western part of the country. I can't remember off the top of my head how that compares with the rough storage facility. Gareth, you may do, but we might need notice.
It's in theory a bit easier to open up a small one. Yeah, small relative to something that's 30 terawatt hours. But they would be new build, whereas we've got plenty of tired or extinct gas wells, and there is already an opportunity. They've already been surveyed. There's a big cavern in there waiting to be filled. So for the UK, it's probably cheaper to reuse those than to build new gas storage on land, though there are some advantages to it.
I mean, we've got masses of potential gas storage offshore in exhausted gas fields. I mean, Rough is by no means the only one. And it may not always be possible to repurpose the connecting infrastructure, but it's relatively cheap to reconnect. And remember that the whole point of a gas field or an oil field is that the geological seal actually traps the hydrocarbons underneath. And so by definition, those fields can trap the methane underneath, whether it's biomethane or whether it's natural gas. So they are there. And you're asking there, I think, Nitin Rai, about disused coal mines. I think Gareth's point is a very good one. I think that we've got a lot of disused gas fields that are probably going to be cheaper than disused coal mines, certainly because the coal mines will not necessarily have those gas-tight geological seals that, by definition, an old oil or gas field must have. Anonymous attendee, how does the energy crop feedstock for biomethane compare with feedstocks for other biofuels such as sustainable aviation fuels? Are they competing for the same crops? There's an important question actually there as well later on about, given that this is really a rather valuable resource, how do we know that we're going to end up with the right use as identified by the model, as opposed to the people who can simply afford to pay more for it, which may well be the airlines. I don't know whether Gareth and Craig want to comment on that, but sustainable aviation fuels is a Gareth special subject. The next Department for Transport civil servant.
So first point on that one is that in the UK, no SAF can be rewarded if it's made out of crop. Doesn't matter whether it's imported. If it's made directly from a crop, as opposed to a residue or a waste, then it can't be rewarded. So there basically isn't crop-derived SAF in the UK. Even the stuff that the EU classes as not a real crop, that is a real crop, won't be eligible under UK rules. Now, one of the big crops is this kind of rapeseed oil relative. I cannot remember what they call it, but it's basically rape, just not edible by humans. No, it's not usable for food, which is a choice to breed it like that to make it not a crop, because complete dodge. But it's the same stuff. Now, you can press that for the oil and use that, and indeed use the residual oil from the pressings as well to make yourself some SAF. The stems and the rest of the plant can't really use that for SAF, but you can take that and drop that into an AD plant. So even if you're doing that with growing crop for SAF, you can get some of it will contribute to SAF, but the remainder, the wastes from that, can still go into AD. So even when you have SAF crops, you still have AD capacity being grown. So that's one of them. And the other one is that generally they're not going to compete, because you're much better using oily compounds to go straight to a diesel or a kerosene substitute than you are putting them into AD. Some AD operators like to chuck a bit of oily stuff in there because fats make the bacteria go faster, but they also generate a lot of foam and can blow the lid off an AD plant. So you need to be a bit balanced about it. So ultimately, I don't think there is much of a competition.
Okay, I don't know. I mean, we may need notice on the question, the broader question of whether or not the market is likely to deliver the sort of rank order of uses that the BMA model suggests. All I would say is that we're in an area in moving to net zero where we're capturing, in market terms, an enormous number of externalities through things like carbon pricing, the emissions trading scheme, and so on. And therefore, we're in a world where policy is making a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the transition. The transition to net zero, I don't think, would happen if it wasn't for the overall policy framework, and that is going to be absolutely crucial. So that's perhaps a part of the answer, but I'll think about it more, and I don't know whether Craig or Gareth want to add anything there. No. Okay.
No,
let's move on. Yeah, Craig? No? Okay. So we've got Dominic Ellis looking at the EBA data on biomethane and salt capacity. France has shot up a lot. Germany's increased. UK has gone down. I don't think that's quite true. I think the UK continues to rise, Dominic.
We think the EBA data is wrong. I saw that. It was saying 6.8 terawatt hours the other day. I haven't got round to taking it up with them as
yeah.
I think their data is wrong.
Yeah, the EBA data is wrong, but what is true, Dominic, and there's no doubt about this, is that the UK sector has been growing more slowly than the sectors on the continent, and that arises from a very simple reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the increase in the gas price. The European Commission and most EU governments reacted in part by making biogas and biomethane one of the three key pillars of their response to the gas crisis. By contrast, the British government at the time was so overloaded with Brexit that it was able to produce a paper on energy security which managed to completely omit any mention of biogas or biomethane whatsoever, despite the energy security aspects and despite the import substitution aspects. So I'm afraid, don't get me started on that, but we are thankfully in a position where the government is thinking seriously about the advantages of biomethane. And we've gone from a position where clearly in the early 2010s, we were a leader in all sorts of things. Renewable heat incentive, for example, was the first renewable heat policy measure anywhere in the world, to a situation today where we've been lagging and we need to catch up. Gareth,
we can talk about what the French have done right, because that is probably the strongest argument we've got, which is, so the French have given a right to inject to operators, so the gas network has to take them seriously and not just shuffle them off to one side and hope they go away, which has historically been a bit of a problem in the UK. And they've set a guaranteed target for gas injection to the grid. There's effectively a blending mandate. So there is a guaranteed market for the gas, guaranteed route to injection, and they're also socializing the cost of grid reinforcement and reverse compression. So if you've injected into the distribution section of the network and that starts to fill up, you might need to push it back up into the transmission network, which Craig mentioned earlier. There's basically a backbone in the UK of a transmission network. Most countries have something like it, which is a very high pressure network. And so you can't just open the taps and flood stuff back into it unless you've got a special reverse compression system. And the French are socializing the costs of these, which can be quite pricey and require a degree of specialist equipment to do, not surprisingly. So these are things that France have done to really accelerate their biomethane injection. I think they've also probably made the same mistake that we have, which is that they've offered a tariff to small producers to inject, and are assuming that when the tariff comes to an end, the small producers will continue to stay connected, which is probably a little bit optimistic. But they've done a lot of things really well to accelerate the industry, and we should be looking at that very seriously.
And Gareth, just to put in a little advert, I said at the beginning, anybody who wanted to come to the expo in Birmingham, you can have free entry, and there is a session which I'm chairing with some exceptionally good French speakers on the policy, on what's been happening in France, where biomethane has been growing like the clappers, and everybody's trying to get in there, not just the usual suspects, Engie and Total Energy and so forth, but lots of others too. So anybody who's interested in biomethane, not just in the UK, but more widely, France and some other very good examples, there's a session for you at the NEC in Birmingham at the Expo. If you just look up World Biogas Association ADBA for the NEC, you'll find it. Cato Stanford asked, surprised to hear the argument about biomethane replacing imported natural gas one-to-one. Surely that flies in the face of economic logic, as an artificially increased supply will lead to more consumption. Well, it would be nice to think that, Cato, but the reality is that we are, somebody typing rather, is that you, Gareth?
Sorry, that's me. I'm just answering a couple of easy ones in the chat so that we can get through.
Just Cato, on the imported gas, the fundamental build-up to a price is basically it's a world price, and it's a world price which is currently for fossil gas determined by the export opportunities out of the US. The natural gas price in Europe is about 4.5 times as high as it is in the US. And that's happened basically because there weren't enough export terminals to export LNG from the US. That's now changing. And you probably are going to see a gradual alignment of the prices, allowing for transport costs in between. But this is fundamentally a commodity. So if you produce some more of it at home, because you've set your policy to attractively produce it at home, then you're going to substitute for imports. And frankly, because the consumer is dealing with a world price plus a bit of extras which are determined at home, it's unlikely to affect demand. But by all means, come back to me if you think that I'm getting the economics wrong on that.
On that one, Chris, as well, just from a sort of techno-economic modeling point of view, the fact that there's that global constraint on carbon and the carbon budgets and carbon target that have to be met, and the fact that biomethane and imported methane are very different in terms of their carbon impact, that creates a constraint that means, that you do get that displacement from a just sort of a modeling optimization point of view. Whether the real world regulation and so on and so forth would allow that to happen, maybe you'd be a better place to answer. But it's not just pure market forces operating here. We've got this artificial sort of thing, which is the carbon budgets. There are also, certainly in terms of our optimization, affecting that.
Yep. Mike Roberts has got a question here about CO2. How is it captured and stored long term? It's not necessarily easy if not near a major offshore storage pipeline. We're getting a bit far away from biomethane. But all I would say about that is remember what I said about all of those available old gas fields, and they can be repurposed to store CO2 as well as storing methane, as well as doing all sorts of other stuff. I would say we do have a lot of opportunities in the UK. Gareth?
Yeah, we've got there's a lot of consultations out about what they call non-pipeline transport, moving it, basically collecting it by trucks, moving it to an injection hub. So for the more remote sites, it's most likely that we'll end up with that, which is, there's already an extensive CO2 transport industry. I think Craig's got something to.
From a modeling in the model that we use here, we were quite conservative in terms of where carbon could be captured and stored on scale, and it was basically around the industrial clusters where there's the various CCUS initiatives underway, and there are pipelines either planned or currently, to sort of Rough and the Viking and so on in the Irish Sea. So you can only capture and store the carbon in those locations with pretty good confidence that will be able to occur on scale. So we're quite conservative in our assumptions in that regard. There probably could be more widely distributed carbon capture and storage, as Gareth was saying, than we actually modelled.
Okay, Kato Sanford's got a question about the construction of CCS facilities and what we are assuming in the model, Craig. Have you just disappeared? I'm afraid, Kato, we may need, I don't know quite why Craig has suddenly disappeared. We've also lost the connection here. And this may mean that we're getting to the witching hour and we have to...
Yes, I think, unfortunately, Chris, it's been really interesting, and obviously there's an awful lot of questions coming through, but we're going to have to wind down. So, yeah, if you could just...
I'm sorry about that, but do start by looking at the study itself, the Net Zero study. I think it repays a quick read, and it's got some very good conclusions in it. So at that point, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Do take up the invitation to come for free. All invitees come in for free to the Expo. There are 2 ongoing conferences with sessions at the Expo, and there's some really interesting sessions on things like, for example, what's going on in France, if you're interested in that particular issue, as I am. And indeed Gareth is, because we think the French are doing a lot of the right things, and we ought to be a bit more French when it comes to how we're treating biomethane. Not always an easy thing to advocate in the UK. But thank you very much to everybody. That was marvellous, and I hope to see you all in Birmingham, if not at another time. Thank you.